Let's get into our reading for the day. We are reading The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. Let's see where we land on today. What the spirits say we need to read. Oh, this is a good one. Income taxes and war bonds. This is from page 382. Income taxes and war bonds. The nation's first experiment with the income tax was tried at this time, another violation of the Constitution. By today's standards, it was a small bite, but it was still an extremely unpopular measure, and Congress knew that any additional taxes would further fan the flames of rebellion. Previously, the traditional source of funding in time of war had been the banks, which simply created money under the pretense of lending it. But that method had been severely hampered by the demise of the Bank of the United States. The state banks were anxious to step into that role, but by this time, most of them had already defaulted in their promise to pay in specie, and were in no position to manufacture further money. At least not money which the public would be willing to accept. American banks may have been unable to supply adequate loans, but the Rothschild Consortium in Britain was both able and willing. It was during this time that the Rothschilds were consolidating their new industrial holdings in the United States through their agent, August Belmont. Derek Wilson tells us they owned or had major shareholdings in Central American ironworks, North American canal construction companies, and a multiplicity of other concerns. They became the major importers of bullion from the newly discovered gold fields. Belmont had placed large amounts of Rothschild money into the bonds of state-sponsored banks in the South. Those bonds, of course, had fallen in value to practically zero. As the war shifted in favor of the North, however, he began to buy up as many additional bonds as he could, paying but a few pennies on each dollar of face value. It was his plan to have the Union force the Southern states at the end of the war to honor all of their pre-war debt obligations in full. That, of course, would have been a source of gigantic speculative profits to the Rothschilds. Meanwhile, on the northern side of the Mason-Dixon line, Belmont became the chief agent for the sale of Union bonds in England and France. It was rumored that when Belmont called on President Lincoln and personally offered Rothschild money at 27.5% interest, he was rudely thrown out of the office. The story is doubtful, but it represents a larger truth. Profiting from war and placing money on both sides of the conflict were exactly the kinds of maneuvers for which the Rothschilds had become famous throughout Europe and were now practicing in America. In the North, the sale of government bonds was the one measure for raising funds that seemed to work. Even that, however, with the lure of compounded interest to be paid in gold at a future date, failed to raise more than about half the needed amount. So the Union faced a real dilemma. The only options remaining were 1, terminate the war, or 2, print fiat money. For Lincoln and the Republicans who controlled Congress, the choice was never seriously in doubt. The president had already been set during the War of 1812. At that time, Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin had abrogated the constitutional ban against bills of credit by printing Treasury notes, most of which paid interest at 5.4%. The money was never declared legal tender, and that probably was the basis on which it was defended as constitutional. Until next time.